Shalom, Torah fans. It has now been 2 weeks since Tim Mahoney's latest film, Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy, came out in over 900 theaters across the United States of America. I asked Tim to come back because he was in the middle of telling a story in our last Shabbat Night Live of the time that he and several others of the adventure class went over to Saudi Arabia to the real Mount Sinai. Tim, good to have you back with us. Thanks for being with us. We could sit and I could listen to your stories week after week, month after month, and thankfully you're putting these out on movies in movie theaters that are going out around the world. We were talking about the Mount Sinai, that adventure, as we signed off last time. Please pick it up again. Tell us about that adventure where Jim and Penny Caldwell, Leonard Moeller, Aaron Sen, and
Dr. Glenn Fritz.
Glenn Fritz joined you in that adventure where I do believe that you ended up with a gun barrel in the back of your head down in a ditch. But tell us what happened before then.
Well, actually, the idea, one time, I'll share this with you. I was sitting in my living room in 2002, and Dr. Leonard Moeller, who I had just met, I had asked him to come from Sweden, and we were discussing all of this, and he had written a book called The Exodus Case. And so I was very interested in what he was talking about, and I started learning more about different scholars and different archaeologists and different Bible explorers, and Ron Wyatt was one of those, and hearing all this different information and trying to sort it out. Well, what was, some people were saying where Mount Sinai was at different locations than other people. And then this hot topic, we always use the word hot topic of Mount Sinai being in Saudi Arabia. It's hot. Yeah. And he said to me, I think I'm going to go there.
Leonard hadn't been there at that point in time.
No. And
now I know that Ron Wyatt had really conveyed a lot of material to Leonard, and Leonard, as a scientist, he was with Karolinska Institute, Stockholm, Sweden. That understands the laboratory that awards the Nobel Prize in Science. So this is real science, and so Ron has laid into his hands a lot of this evidence, so he's searching at it from a purely scientific background then.
Yes, I think that, and I've learned about the relationship, through talking with Leonard, and so Leonard was he had written books, and he took it from a scientific standpoint, and as a DNA research scientist, and he then started to lay out the information. And I don't know all the history of that, but when I came into it, I believe there was a book that was written, and I met Leonard after that. And he's told me then that he felt that he was going to go to Saudi Arabia at some time, and would I come with him? And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, what I've heard about this, I don't see how that would ever be possible. And literally within 1 year, doors opened up for us in 2003 to go, and we got officially. So we officially were allowed to go there. And but as we said, once we got into the location, to the area, it's like people from one part of a country going to another part of the country, to two different parts of the country of Saudi Arabia didn't know what the other one knew or whatever. So the people from the east took us to the west, to the northwest, and that's because they were interested in seeing that part of their nation as well. And that's when we got into the challenges that everyone gets into.
Well, I got to hear a little bit about it after the fact, but Jim and Penny Caldwell called me and told me that they were going in to pray for him, but said, don't say anything. We're going in with Tim Mahoney, Leonard Moeller, and Aaron Sen, and the others, and said they were going to do it. But I knew better than to say anything about this because I knew how dangerous it could be. And you actually went in there with them, and you had really documentation to be able to go in there. You were going with a former U.S. official with the embassy, and you had permits to go in there.
We were supposed to be there and everything, but just because you're supposed to be there doesn't mean you're supposed to be there. It doesn't matter. So that was one of the challenges, is that, you know, we had the paperwork to be there, but the people that lived there didn't want us to be there. And then where do you go? Because you're supposed to be at certain places. And so we were able to be at the mountain. We actually walked through and looked at all, you know, the pillars and went up and climbed up.
So these are the pillars that are down by the corral, down by where the altar was?
Yes.
So you saw those firsthand?
Yes. Yep. And so that began. We climbed up, and it's not easy to climb because...
So you went past the fence, you went up onto the mountain, up onto Mount Sinai.
Yeah, and the fence was washed out in certain places, so it was kind of like open, and yes, there.
And so you pretended you could not see the sign, the archaeological site, by royal decree, or what?
No, we put it like this: we were allowed to be there.
Okay.
And so, and I was of good conscience. I had no sense that I was, you know, we were doing something that wasn't allowed, because we were allowed to be there, and we were interested, and it was an opportunity to build relationships with, you know, people from America and people from Saudi.
Oh, wonderful.
And so we felt that we had permission. And the Caldwells were astounded, because that wasn't the way it had been before when they were trying to do this. But it wasn't until we came down from the mountain that things then became more difficult. And because I was the person with the camera gear, and I was, you know, my camera making, my documentary, I guess, professionalism was there. I mean, I was taking shots. I was building the whole story. I was doing that. Mm-hmm. I wasn't the normal tourist.
Right. It's obvious with the camera gear that you have that you are a professional. This isn't somebody on vacation.
Right, right. And I had asked for permission for me to go there with camera gear, and I was given permission to go there. I just said I was interested in it. And when we came down from the mountain, then I was, that night, they really wanted to know why I was there. And I said, well, I'm interested in this area. I'm interested in the story of Moses, and that's
who are the they that?
Well, it's the people that we came with. You know, they were like, because they were feeling pressure from the locals, and they didn't know that there was any connection to Moses at that time.
Okay, so you knew where you were, Mount Sinai, altar to the golden calf, all this, but they didn't know what you were doing there.
Right, and it was a big surprise for them. So once the locals told them that this might be connected or related to Moses and the Israelites, that's when it became difficult for them as well, because here they had these Americans and Europeans, and, you know, camping. We're out there, you know, we got tents and sleeping at the same location where all this happened. We were there a couple of days. And then we had to move on. Then we moved on into other locations, because we were trying to see all the different sites that the route from the sea that the Israelites might have taken.
Now, I usually don't ask questions about how you feel about things. That doesn't usually interest me so much, but I really have to ask you the question. You're camping there at the site where Israel camped at the base of this mountain. What did that feel like? Well,
you start to, let's say whenever you're at a location like this, it does make a difference to be there, and to be in an environment, and to be there. There felt, if there's one thing, it felt like a very ancient place. I'll tell you that. Especially when you look at the rock art, you look at the different, and it's also a very isolated place. It's not easy to get to, and you can imagine that it's possible that people hadn't been there. It's not where people travel normally. It's not an easy place to get to, and it's not a place that at this time you would have thought that there'd be a lot of people living. I mean, so I think it's been protected. I guess is the sense that I had was that it's been so isolated for so long that in a sense it was preserved. Yeah. That was an idea that came, you know, that was there. And then you could obviously knowing, I can imagine that that this is where the tents would have been. If this is the site for the Israelites, if this is where they were, then you look and say, well, where would they have built the tabernacle, and where were these different pieces of, or well, I shouldn't say pieces, but where were the tribes? Where would they have stayed? And so you can just look at all that, and you just have a sense of it. At the same time, there's a sense of concern, because I came with this understanding that it's not easy to be here, and at first it was like, wow, this is wonderful that we're here and it's so easy, and then it started to become very, very difficult because we were not welcomed at that time.
Yeah, when you speak of the remoteness, we're reminded of as they came from the Yam Suf, they traveled and they got to an oasis with the 12 wells and the 70 palms, and that's the first place of watering that they came to. Amara was just before that, the bitter waters where they couldn't drink, and so then after the 12 wells, then they come to the split rock, and they're out of water again. The entire nation is thirsting, and so the water is produced out of the smitten rock at that point. And then it's another 8 miles, as I understand, to where you were camping at Mount Sinai. So it is a circuitous route to get to that place of the camping site. Yeah,
and it's beautiful, by the way. I mean, when you're in the desert in an area like that, it's very, very beautiful. The desert is a beautiful place. I never thought I would have said that, but there's something very drawing about these areas, and but you also realize that it can be very dangerous as far as the extremes of needing water. Where do you find where would you get something to eat or drink? And you understand how desperate that can be. But I think that the thing is that from the campsite, then we went towards, as I remember it, we headed towards the Split Rock area that the Caldwells had identified as the Split Rock. And when you hear me talk about these places, I know for a lot of people, they've made that decision. Okay, this is the Split Rock, this is Mount Sinai, these are different places. And as an investigative documentary, I'm looking at all of the different mountains and I'm comparing them and saying, well, where does the pattern fit the best? And so originally when I started making films about this, I was only making one point of view, which was I was covering just the crossing site at a particular place. And over time, I started to realize that people actually don't even want to watch a film if they think it's only one point of view, because they think that that's just your propaganda. And so what I became clear to me was that I needed to show you the options so that you could look at
kind of a skeptic's viewpoint or overview.
Maybe it didn't happen, or if it did, where did it happen? And if it did, when did it happen? And what is the evidence there? And what we found is that in a patterns of evidence film, the goal is to give you a freedom to make a choice. Okay, sometimes if you only have one choice, you don't feel like you're free to make it. And so, as we're working now, as we move forward in these films, patterns of evidence, we had the Exodus, the Moses controversy, now the Red Sea miracle.
That's the next one that's coming out.
And then Journey to Mount Sinai. And what was hard was I had been saving this material for a long time, and not really saving it, but still, in a sense, it's been saved, but it's been sitting there as we've been trying to understand and develop the right way to tell the story and the right time to tell the story. And I think there are different, and I never felt the freedom to move forward. I tried many times. You know this too. I made 2 films before the first Patterns of Evidence film came out.
Yeah, and I thought, this brilliant, you got to get it out as soon as possible, because I'm feeling the urgency as we get older. It's like, these are the greatest evangelical tools. This is what I'm thinking that we've ever had. This proves the veracity of the Hebrew Scriptures, and so I thought, man, get this out. But actually what you've done is laying a much more secure foundation by giving all the skeptics all their viewpoints in this, so everyone can make up their own mind.
If you have the opportunity to basically really explore a subject by giving the different viewpoints. It's like building a fortress, because now you know you're not just picking the first thing. You've really looked at it, and what it does to a person's faith, and I can tell you that it frees people to believe. Because otherwise they're thinking, well, I can't make a decision yet because I don't have all the information. Mm-hmm. And what the approach is if like, as I said before, I'm going to risk the story, I'm going to risk the Bible, and what I mean by risk is maybe it's not true as what you're saying, but what if I'm showing you something and maybe it is? Are you willing to accept if I show you a pattern of evidence that it might be true? And am I willing to accept if there's no evidence that it might not be true? No. Obviously, we have faith, but these events are said to have happened, right? So we believe a lot of things by faith, but many people are saying, none of it's true. And we're saying, but wait a minute, what is the Bible saying? Let's go back and look. And so far, we've found incredibly powerful patterns.
Mm-hmm. Now, you took all this film gear, you took a crew up there, you've got all these people that are searching for these sites, and did you come back with any of that?
It's a great question. We came back with, what happened was that when we went to the Split Rock, that's when we really got into a situation. We were there for a few hours filming, and I tell you, I think I filmed some of the greatest. I really worked hard at getting amazing photography, and was able to do a great job. I felt really good about it. I worked really hard for several weeks. We were in Saudi for 2 weeks. That's
a very hostile environment out there in the desert like that.
Yeah, and
no manna to depend on the next day.
Yeah, and I was under a lot of pressure because I was the guy with the camera. I had another filmmaker with me, a friend of mine that came, Rick Garside. But between the two of us, we were filming, and we had all this footage. And when we got to the Split Rock area, that's when the locals said, leave in 5 minutes or we'll kill you. It was one of those leave or else, Mm-hmm. And I remember Rick said, I don't think they mean it. I said, Rick, we're not going to find out. I said, we need to go.
And so you really felt that it was a death threat, that they were going to do something about it if you didn't leave.
Yeah, I was concerned, and so we all had to pack up, and we had to leave. So there's a certain amount of confrontation. This is back in 2002, or I'm sorry, 2003. So it was, it was a lot of stress. It was and so eventually we went down to the sea, which would be the Gulf of Aqaba, and looked at the areas where the Israelites, if they crossed there, would have come up. And we filmed, all that. We were hoping to do some diving.
Yeah, you had Leonard Muller with you,
yeah.
Who had in 2001, he was the one that took the robotic dive cameras down and filmed these coral-encrusted remains of chariots.
Yeah.
And so, he knew where to take you then.
Yeah. And so, and the Caldwells were there too. I mean, they had gone and they had been trying to work out these and all the different trips that they had had. And then Dr. Glenn Fritz was also gathering information because he's written several books now, and on this whole topic of the Exodus. So what happened was that at the end of it, we didn't leave with any footage. They asked for it, and all I had was still photography. And we thought maybe we would get it back, and year after year we were hoping, months, or first it was maybe in a month, or then 2 months, 3 months, 5 months. Eventually it became, we're never seeing this footage. And that was, sad. But I'd worked with the Caldwells, I'd filmed them a lot, and I had their footage. But it wasn't until later when other people like Andrew Jones was out filming, and we contacted each other, I'm not sure who contacted who, but I was able to work with him.
Well, that's where the story takes on a different turn, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute. So this whole adventure into Mount Sinai, in that area, you have all of the video footage that you spent so much time and energy on, and it was all taken from you. And then the only thing I saw was the photograph that was taken with Jim and Penny sitting in the split rock at Rephidim. And that's what that's what I've blown up, and it's actually here in our office, because this is the Mount Sinai Museum as far as I can do. But how did that go down for you with all this material that you'd worked so hard being taken away from you?
You know, it was puzzling, to be honest with you. I mean, let's remember, I started this project, really started it earlier on in 2001 with Search for the Red Sea Crossing, the Exodus Revealed, thinking I was going to be involved just helping them distribute that film, which led me into going to Egypt, which then led me the next year to meeting Jim and Penny Caldwell, and then this door opening up for us to go to Saudi Arabia. And in the very beginning, I was struggling with how do I deal with this tension of this sort of dangerous place where people think the biblical stories are happening, and how, I mean, when we say it's difficult to get there, you can't talk about it. I talk to scholars, they say, yeah, there's all sorts of stories of this, but we can't talk about it, we can't investigate it. And so then how do you make a story about that? And people did then. They started making, short films about this and saying that that there was something over there, and that there were pillars, that there was an altar, that there was a cave that could be the cave of Elijah. And so there's the split rock. And so as I'm working through this, trying to understand how to tell this story, we're meeting other people, and that's when Dr. Kim comes along, and we hear about him and the fact that he went to this location. And for people who don't know who Dr. Kim is,
tell us the story about Dr. Kim.
Yeah, well, Dr. Kim was a physician, I think, more in the chiropractic world, and he actually ended up going to Saudi Arabia, and he served for one of the top princes in Saudi. And he was like a son to Dr. Kim was like a son to this prince, and he was his personal physician. But then when he heard about these types of this possibility that Mount Sinai was there, he wanted to go see it for himself. And so he made numerous trips, and he ran into some very difficult situations there as well. But he kept feeling drawn to go back to this mountain. He couldn't explain it. It didn't, it didn't make sense. But he kept going back with his family and his wife, and it was very dangerous. And people warned him, this is like the Wild West out there. Anything could happen to you. And that's his story to tell. But he almost lost his life because it's just a dangerous situation out there.
Well, we hope to have him on to be able to tell a story. And we do have the photograph of him in which he is right by the rock that has the menorah engraven on this rock. And so, as far as we know, it is the earliest record of the menorah, and it is there in northwest Saudi Arabia.
And that's what I was interested in, getting his testimony and in interviewing him. And there are things that happen in this journey, some that I can share and some that I can't share. And I've talked with you about that because of all sorts of. I mean, people say, well, why can't, they're just...
Yeah, people, with what we're doing here, we're giving them just the brief fraction of what we can talk about, but what we can't talk about could fill volumes, and hopefully in the future, it'll be released to where you can share these volumes.
Right. At times, there'll be a time when we can talk more about it. The unusual things of providence that happen, and as well as some of the intrigue. But there's a reason why you don't share certain things, is because you want to be careful whenever you're dealing in other parts of the world. You just have to be wise about what you talk about and how things go forward. And we plan to continue to work in those areas. So all that said, that there are times when people go before their time and then the doors close. And sometimes that could be said that had we been able to get archaeologists to certain places before it was a hot potato, you could have dug and found more out. But if you're in, if you get there too fast and then they think it's this, you'll never be able to dig there. And that is one of the challenges that happened when Ron Wyatt was caught, and when he told them what they thought this was. That's when the area, I have archaeologists that say I could have dug there, and then after the fact you could interpret it. But now we'll never be able to deal with that unless something changes.
Well, and things are changing now, as we both know, and I think this is a good time to express our gratitude to the Saudi government for keeping this and protecting this area. What you felt that you had to go in, even though you had permit, and it was dangerous to go into. It's dangerous for a reason, because people cannot go in there and defile the place, cannot make off with the articles, and now we know the Shabbat Night Live has actually been shown on Saudi Arabian television with Arabic subtitles, all as we lay this stuff out. So they know that it's there, and they have plans that may be positive for us to be able to get back in, and for the whole world to be able to see these things, which I think that you'll be very much instrumental in helping to get this out if that happens.
Yes, and that's what I've heard as well. And so there's a timing to things. And I think if you read in scriptures, it was appointed at this time, and that phrase, comes out. There's a particular time when things are supposed to happen, and we get impatient. We want to be done. And I remember sitting in church one Sunday and asking for forgiveness about not getting this done. And I felt in my heart, it was like, this film will be done when I say it's finished, not when you're tired of working on it. What you're building is a fortress, not a facade. If you build a facade, people will surround it and knock it over. But if you build a fortress, it'll be strong on all sides. And when it rises up into the culture, people can attack it, but they won't be able to destroy it because it's a fortress. They'll just have to deal with it. And that understanding, I had that understanding in year one. Actually, at the end of year one, it took 11 more years before Patterns of Evidence came out, because I kept trying to make it in my own way. And then I had to basically find a new way. The phrase, a new wine and a new wineskin. Well, we sometimes look at the past and want to repeat it, but there's, if it's really being guided, then it needs to be, you have to trust that this new wineskin is going to work. And because there's no model for it. It's a whole new thing.
Now, there was something that transpired. Not only was all of the video evidence that you secured taken away from you, but then I found that there was a young man back many years before, decades before, was in junior high, that actually missed a lecture by Ron Wyatt. His father went to it and came back, and from that point on, when he came back and saw some of the video evidence, it became such a burden to him, and it would never let him go. And now, I guess in his 30s, he's actually gone over there, was able to get in with drones, high-definition drone footage, and he has come back with stuff that wasn't available when you were, and this is now going to be part of Patterns of Evidence, the next movie.
Right. And are we talking about the same person?
Andrew Jones. I think we can say it publicly.
Yeah. Andrew is really a great guy. And he's been able to go there in a very winsome way. He's a really, really likable person. Yeah. And he's worked hard at this. And I contacted him and just said, hey, could we work together? I explained to him a little bit of what I was doing, and we all have our roles to play. I've had to work hard over the years to be a documentary filmmaker, to make theatrical documentaries that get into theaters. And, that's taken literally almost 40 years for me to learn how to do this, and to make them and to weave in the story of the Bible, and to go see my skill set is to meet archaeologists and Egyptologists and Bible scholars and talk with them and be generous with them and to understand what they're saying. Even if they're saying that they don't believe in the Bible, I need to understand why. because their reasons are important for us to basically deal with those questions. And so that's my skill set. Then I really feel like I'm a weaver. And I'm taking a journey personally to go and ask these questions and try to see, is there a solution to this? So in a way, the audience is going along with me to whether it's Israel or Saudi or Egypt or Jordan or Oxford or Cambridge in England, and I'm going to take them along with me to investigate these questions so that together we can find answers. And I'm not going to be afraid of the questions. In other words, the big questions that they say that there aren't there, then say, okay, well, let's go see if we can find an answer to that question. And what we've found so far is that there's so much more. It's just huge. The first film that I made, when I realized that I needed to focus on the pattern of evidence in Egypt, the first film I made only had about 3 minutes. So that first film that I made, turned into 2 hours of patterns of evidence. So sometimes I think we want to get ahead of God, and we want to rush in and just do something. And had I done that, you and I wouldn't be sitting here. I would just have been another thing, because I didn't want it to be that. So I had to be patient and wait and try to understand what's the next thing that I'm supposed to be doing.
I think we can both recognize that this is not our story. It is his story, and he is the one from heaven that is weaving all these things together. As I say, I wasn't in the Garden Tomb. I wasn't digging with Ron Wyatt. I didn't go over to Mount Sinai with Jim and Penny Caldwell. I've been trying to faithfully tell the story of their adventures, and as you have attempted to tell their story, now the Almighty has brought other people in the next generation who are coming along and telling this. With as you say, with Andrew, and he brought Ryan Murrow over to Saudi Arabia, and his mother over to Saudi Arabia, of all things, and the continuing investigation into Noah's Ark and these other things that we were trying to get this out years and years ago. Jim and I were sitting together talking with Penny, and I said, we were trying to get this out 20 years ago, get this message out, and we were looking at each other. Between the two of us, we've got 13 heart bypasses, and it's like, we didn't know that it was going to take this long, and we didn't want it to take this long, but it's not our story. It's his story that's being told. And I see with what your crisis of faith, and that was the thing that really impacted me, the crisis of faith that really is taking you into the patterns of evidence that you are now showing to the whole world. And it's just not 2, it's not just 3. You've really got an entire series of planned, and you've been recording these things for decades now.
Yes, it's almost 20 years. And but part of what happened is that you have to, I think, doctors don't just become a doctor. They have to go through all sorts of training, and there's an internship, and I mean, there's years and years of education before they practice. And in a way, if I'm going to be an investigative filmmaker on these, I've had years and years of training. I'm just starting to practice the right way to deal with patterns. You see, and I think the genius of patterns of evidence is its approach, in the sense that it's the idea that we would say, let's use a scientific approach to look for patterns that match the biblical story. And you can find them in archaeology, you can find them in historical record, in geography, and you can see these patterns start shaping. And they testify. What we're asking is there evidence that God acted in history? And that's what this is about. Did God act in the history of the Exodus? Is there evidence for that? Is there evidence that God acted in the history of the writing of the Bible, the Torah, the first 5 books? Yes, there's an amazing pattern. And so I feel as if that what my role is to basically continue in a very, I'm surprised by it as well, because I look at it and go, I'm not sure how we figured this out. We were just more or less led to these different patterns. And so the next pattern comes up. Is it possible that God can part water? And if so, where did this happen? And can we explain it? And what happened? And so that's the next film, Patterns of Evidence, the Red Sea Miracle. So as we look at that, and then Patterns of Evidence, Journey to Mount Sinai. And then as we continue to look at these patterns, and you can see they unfold through the entire Bible, as you can see as the patterns start to come. Because the pattern is important, as we said earlier. It's one thing to find one piece of information and hang everything on that. But it's like, putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah, this little piece fits in here, but nothing else works. But people try to go, well, I'm going to cut off this piece. We won't talk about that. And we're going to go over here. And it just doesn't work.
So much of what I see in the production, the different television programs that talk about the Bible is so much that. They snip off a piece here, a piece there, and they paste it together. And the people that know a little bit about the Bible realize this is ridiculous. This is, borderline insanity to, cut a verse here, a verse there, and reassemble it into your own theology. Or the same thing is done in scientific world, is snipping a piece of evidence here and a piece there, and yet ignoring the great body of evidence that's out there. I think you're giving a very balanced approach by letting all the skeptics lay it out, give it their best shot. How are you going to convince us that the Bible is not real? How are you going to convince us that the Hebrew language in no form of it exists in the time of Moses? Give us your best shot. You give them the best shot.
Because if you look at it, you realize that if I'm going to give this up, the Bible says that if I'm going to give up belief in the Bible or belief in God, if I'm going to give this up, you better have good reasons for me to give it up. I need to understand why you think I should not believe this, and I'm going to go and investigate it. And that's what I appreciate. So about, let's say, Ron Wyatt or the Leonard Mollers or the Aaron Sens or the Andrews, they're basically saying, okay, this is what I heard, but I'm willing to risk going out there. Now, I'm talking to both the skeptic, the agnostic, the atheist, and the Bible explorer, and the conservative biblical people, and the Egyptologist people. And so I basically decided everyone's an opportunity here. Because the Bible explorers that I have, the Exodus explorers, I know what it's like to go into a dangerous situation and search for evidence of the Bible. Some people have never done that, and they're very highly critical of these other people. They're just armchair quarterbacks, and so I'm thinking, well, as part of the overall storytelling, the overall story of what's going on here, they are a part of that. That's why I've opened this investigation up much larger than, and that's why it's taken longer, because it's a bigger investigation, and I'm having more clarity as to how to tell this story, and I find that it works. It works. I had a young man see the test showing, and his mother brought him. He's an agnostic. And at the end of the film, he came up to me and he said, "I'm an agnostic." I said, "Well, what would you change about this film?" And he goes, "Nothing. I loved it. I loved everything about it." I found out later, a fire was lit. And he then got the Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. They had showings, everything. And he made a huge decision that he was no longer an agnostic.
Yeah, what turned the corner for him? Why did he say he loved the way that you presented the whole thing as an agnostic?
I love the fact that he loved the fact that I included all the other viewpoints, because once again, you see, you have to have them in order to have freedom. In other words, if you hold them back, you don't have the freedom to make a decision. And as a young man, he had to make a decision. He had to make a qualified decision, and you know what he decided? That it was true, that this was connected. And that then impacted him. And so he made a decision that he would become a follower of Yeshua.
Well, that is that's incredible. This is something that, laying it all out, people can make their own decision. You interviewed the people that were contrary, but that also brought you before some of Israel's national leaders, and that's another story in itself. I want you to come back next week. We're going to explore how you got in front of Benjamin Netanyahu, because that is a story that needs to be told. Ladies and gentlemen, join us again next week for Shabbat Night Live. Shavua Tov. Have a good week, have a good Sabbath, and we'll see you before the smoke clears. Good night.